The surprising part is not that Prince Harry lost another fight with the British press. That is the headline everyone already saw. The surprising part is what happened after the loss. Because in most high-profile legal defeats, especially one this expensive, there are usually two safe moves. You either say very little and let your lawyers handle the next step, or you express disappointment, respect the court, and move on carefully. Harry did something else. He did not just say he disagreed with the ruling. He did not simply say he was devastated. In a joint statement with Baroness Doreen Lawrence, he went much further. He framed the judgment as a kind of whitewash. He suggested the court had gone to extraordinary lengths to exonerate the male. And that is the moment where this story changes. Because now the question is no longer just, did Harry lose his case against associated newspapers? The sharper question is, did Harry turn a legal defeat into a reputational trap? This is why the reaction may matter more than the verdict itself. The court decision was bad enough for him. Mr Justice Matthew Nicklin issued a 436-page judgment rejecting the claims. The judge said the claimants had not proved that the male stories were produced through unlawful information gathering. He rejected the broad inferences that Harry and the other claimants were asking the court to make. That already gives Harry's critics plenty to work with. But by publicly attacking the way the court reached that decision, Harry may have given them something bigger. He may have given them a new story. Not Harry versus the tabloids, Harry versus the court. And that is a much more dangerous fight. Because tabloids are one thing. A lot of people dislike them. A lot of people believe they have done real damage. A lot of people are willing to hear Harry out when he talks about press intrusion, private investigators, phone hacking, and the darker history of British media. But the court system is different. You can criticize it, you can appeal, you can argue that a judgment is wrong. But when a public figure walks out of a loss and seems to suggest that the court itself effectively cleared or protected the other side, the tone changes. It starts to sound less like disappointment and more like an attack on the referee after the final whistle. And that is where this could backfire. Because Harry's entire public campaign against the press has always depended on one thing: the idea that he is fighting for accountability. Accountability for the tabloids. Accountability for the people who invaded private lives. Accountability for the machinery that, in his telling, helped destroy relationships, fuel paranoia, and make normal life impossible. But accountability cuts both ways. If you ask a court to judge your evidence, and then the court says the evidence is not enough, your next response becomes part of the case in the court of public opinion. And in this case, Harry's response was not quiet. It was not cautious. It was not the language of a man absorbing a painful legal defeat. It was the language of escalation. Let's look at what actually happened. Harry and 6 other claimants, including Baroness Doreen Lawrence, Sir Elton John, David Furnish, Elizabeth Hurley, Sadie Frost, and Simon Hughes, brought claims against Associated Newspapers Limited, the publisher of the Daily Mail, the Mail on Sunday, and Mail Online. The allegations were serious. They accused the publisher of unlawful information gathering. The case touched on alleged phone hacking, private investigators, deception, and intrusive methods used to obtain private information. This was not a small complaint about one article. It was a major legal challenge with years of preparation behind it, an 11-week trial, and costs Associated Newspapers has put above £50 million. For Harry, this case was part of a much bigger personal campaign. He has long argued that the British tabloid press caused enormous damage to him and his family. He has connected the press to the trauma around Princess Diana, to the breakdown of trust inside the royal family, and to the hostility that surrounded Meghan. So for him, this was never just paperwork. It was personal. It was moral. And that is exactly why the reaction after the loss matters so much. Because if a fight is moral, losing it in court can feel unbearable. But the courtroom does not work on moral atmosphere. It does not work on suspicion alone. It does not work on the feeling that something must have happened because the information was private and ended up in a newspaper. That was the heart of the judge's reasoning. Mr. Justice Nicklin said, in substance, that the claimants were asking the court to conclude that because information was private, and because associated newspapers could not always positively explain where it came from, the information must have been unlawfully sourced. The judge rejected that approach. He said, that is not how proof works. And that is the collision at the center of this story. Harry's public narrative is built on lived experience, deep distrust, and the belief that the tabloid machine has operated in ways ordinary people never see. The court's judgment is built on evidence, documents, article-by-article analysis, witness reliability, and whether the claimants proved the specific allegations they brought. Those are two very different languages, and when those languages clash, the person who loses has a choice. They can say, I still believe the system failed, but I respect the court's role. Or they can say, the court has whitewashed the other side. Harry chose the second road. And that road is risky, because the statement was not just emotional, it was aggressive in a way that stands out precisely because it came after a defeat. In the joint statement, Harry and Baroness Lawrence called the result a whitewash. They also criticized what they described as the court's effort to exonerate the male. Those are not soft words. Those are not technical legal objections. Those are words that imply the court did more than simply rule against them. They imply the court helped cleanse the reputation of the newspaper group. And for a man who has already been accused by critics of blaming institutions whenever they fail to validate his version of events, that is a dangerous impression to leave. Now, to be fair, Harry's supporters will hear this very differently. They will say, of course he is angry. They will say the British press has a long, documented history of abuses, and Harry has already won or settled other cases involving other publishers. They will say this is not paranoia, because phone hacking really happened. They will say powerful newspapers rarely leave perfect evidence behind, and the absence of a smoking gun does not mean the system is clean. That argument will resonate with some people, and it is important not to flatten this into a cartoon where Harry is simply throwing a tantrum. His anger did not come from nowhere. He has been in this fight for years. He has had some legal success before. The Mirror case produced findings about widespread and habitual phone hacking. The Sun settlement included an apology connected to unlawful intrusion. So when Harry looks at the broader history of the tabloid press, he sees a pattern. But this case was not decided on the broader emotional pattern. It was decided on whether these claimants proved these allegations against this publisher in relation to these articles. And according to the court, they did not. That is the difference that matters. If you're watching this because you follow the royal legal battles closely, this is the key detail to keep in mind. The court was not asked to rule on whether the British tabloid era was morally ugly. It was asked to rule on specific claims of unlawful information gathering. And if you want more breakdowns that focus on the move after the headline, not just the headline itself, this is exactly the kind of story worth subscribing for, because the follow-up is often where the real damage happens. Here, the follow-up is the story. Because Harry had a path available to him that would have been far less risky. He could have said, I am disappointed. I disagree with the judgment. I remain committed to press accountability. My legal team is reviewing the ruling. That would still signal defiance. It would still keep the cause alive. It would still speak to supporters. But it would not put him in a direct rhetorical clash with the court. Instead, the language of whitewash changes the frame. It invites people to ask whether Harry respects any institution that does not give him the answer he wants. And that question is brutal for him, because it fits into a narrative his critics have been building for years. First, the royal family failed him. Then the palace failed him. Then the British press failed him. Then the government failed him on security. And now, in this telling, the court has failed him too. At some point, even people who are sympathetic to parts of Harry's story may start to ask a harder question. Is every institution corrupt when it disagrees with him? Or is Harry losing the ability to separate a painful outcome from a rigged outcome? That is the reputational danger. Because he does not just need to win arguments with people who already support him. He needs to preserve credibility with people in the middle. People who believe the tabloids can be awful, but also believe courts require evidence. People who think Harry has been treated unfairly at times, but also wonder why every public conflict seems to end with another institution being accused of betrayal. Those are the people this reaction could lose. The 436-page judgment matters because it gives the reaction a solid wall to bounce off. If this had been a thin ruling, a vague ruling, a rushed ruling, Harry's statement might land differently. Viewers might think, maybe the court really did not engage with the case. But this was not presented as a quick dismissal. The judgment was detailed. It came after a long trial. It addressed the evidence. It looked at whether there were lawful source pathways for the information in the articles. It considered whether the claimants could prove that unlawful methods must have been used. And in the end, the judge said the claims were not proved. That does not mean everyone has to agree with him, but it does mean Harry's response now has to compete with a very detailed legal record. And that is not an easy place to fight from. Because emotion is powerful in public, but detail is powerful in law. Harry is speaking to the public in the emotional language of betrayal. The judgment speaks in the legal language of proof. And when a public figure loses on proof, then attacks the outcome as a whitewash, the public may start focusing less on the alleged misconduct and more on the public figure's refusal to accept defeat. That is exactly the opening Associated newspapers needed. Before Harry's statement, A&L already had a strong public position. They could say the court dismissed the claims. They could say the judge found the allegations were not proved. They could say this was a major victory for their journalists. But after Harry's statement, they can do something more useful. They can portray themselves as the side that respected the court, while Harry attacked it. They can turn the story from press misconduct into press freedom. They can say, this was not a brave campaign for justice. This was an expensive, misguided attack on journalism that failed when tested. And whether you like the Mail or not, that is a much cleaner message for them. It is simple. The court heard the case. The court rejected the claims. Harry called it a whitewash. That sequence is devastatingly easy to package, and tabloids are very good at packaging. This is the trap. Harry's campaign against the press is supposed to expose how tabloids twist narratives, but his reaction may have handed them a narrative that is almost too easy to twist. They do not have to relitigate every detail of the 11-week trial for the public. They do not have to walk readers through every article, every source pathway, every witness dispute, every evidential problem. They can tell a simpler story. Harry lost. Then Harry blamed the court. That is the entire danger in one sentence. And in the media environment, simple stories travel faster than complicated ones. This is where the emotional core of the video sits. Harry has spent years presenting himself as a victim of systems bigger than him. The royal system, the media system, the security system, the machinery of public life that, in his account, trapped him inside a role he did not choose and punished him when he left. That story has power because there is truth in parts of it. He did grow up under unbearable scrutiny. He did lose his mother in a way that is permanently tied to paparazzi culture. He did become one of the most hunted public figures in the world before he had any real agency over his own image. So when Harry says the press damaged him, a lot of people can understand why he believes that. But the same narrative becomes weaker when it expands too far. If every loss becomes evidence that another system is unfair, then the victim narrative starts to look less like testimony and more like reflex. That is why this moment is so delicate. Because Harry is not just arguing with a tabloid editor now. He is arguing with the credibility of a court process that examined the case and rejected it. And even if his supporters think he is right morally, the wider public may hear something else. They may hear a man who cannot accept that suspicion is not the same as proof. They may hear a prince who wants accountability for everyone except himself. They may hear someone turning defeat into accusation because the alternative, accepting that this case failed, is too painful. That may sound harsh, but that is exactly how reputational damage works. It does not always come from the original event. Sometimes it comes from the reaction. Think about it this way. A legal loss can be explained. Lawyers can say the standard of proof was high. Supporters can say the case was difficult because the alleged events were historical. Commentators can say the evidence was not strong enough. But the broader issue remains real. There are ways to survive that. But attacking the court's integrity, or appearing to, is much harder to walk back. Because it gives your critics a character argument. Not just he lost, but he cannot lose gracefully. Not just the evidence was weak, but he blames the system whenever the evidence is not enough. That is a much more damaging frame. And once that frame attaches to him, it can contaminate future fights. The next time Harry raises a serious issue, people may remember this reaction first. The next time he talks about justice, critics may ask whether he only respects justice when it rules in his favor. The next time he accuses an institution of failing him, the audience may wonder whether this is a pattern. That is the real backfire risk. Not one bad headline, a credibility tax that follows him into the next story. And there will be a next story. There always is. Because Harry's public life now runs on conflict with institutions. Some of those conflicts are serious, some are personal, some are media-driven, but together they create a rhythm. Harry makes a claim. The institution pushes back. The public divides. The press packages the division. Harry responds. The cycle starts again. This court reaction fits the rhythm almost too perfectly. That is why it feels bigger than one ruling. It looks like another chapter in a pattern that many viewers already think they recognize. And this is where the financial background makes the rhetoric even riskier. Associated Newspapers has put the total legal costs above £50 million. That does not mean Harry personally writes a check for all of it tomorrow. Costs, insurance, liability, and follow-up hearings can be complicated. But the public number matters, because it makes the whole dispute feel enormous. This was not a minor lawsuit. This was not a symbolic complaint. This was a long, expensive, high-stakes legal battle that ended with the claims dismissed. So when the reaction after that kind of defeat is emotional and accusatory, it can look less like strategy and more like panic. That is the perception problem. At a moment when Harry needed to appear controlled, he sounded furious. At a moment when he needed to preserve legal and public credibility, he escalated the language. At a moment when silence might have protected him, he created a second headline. And the second headline may be the one that lasts, because the first headline is predictable. Prince Harry loses privacy case against Daily Mail publisher. That is a big story, but it is also familiar. Harry has been fighting the press for years. He wins some rounds, he loses others. The public has categories for that. The second headline is sharper. Prince Harry attacks court after losing. That is a different kind of story. It is about judgment. It is about temperament. It is about whether he understands the difference between being wronged and being unable to prove a claim in court. And that difference is not small. Courts are not therapy rooms. They are not public confessionals. They are not designed to validate a life story. They are designed to test claims. That can be cold. It can be frustrating. It can feel brutally narrow, especially when the person bringing the claim feels they are trying to expose something much bigger than a single article. But that is also the point of the legal system. It does not simply ask, does this person feel wronged? It asks, has this allegation been proved? And in this case, the judge's answer was no. That answer hurts Harry's campaign.
But his reaction may hurt his campaign more, because it allows opponents to say the campaign was never really about legal accountability. It was about forcing the world to accept Harry's version of events, and when the court refused, the court became the next villain. That may be unfair, it may be too cynical, but it is a powerful line of attack, and public figures do not get to choose only the fairest interpretation of their words. They have to survive the most damaging, plausible interpretation. Harry's statement gave his opponents one. This is also why Baroness Doreen Lawrence's presence in the statement matters. She is not a random co-claimant. She carries a very different moral weight in British public life because of the murder of her son Stephen Lawrence and her long fight for justice. Her history with the Daily Mail is also complicated in a way that cannot be reduced to ordinary celebrity grievance. The Mail once played a major public role in challenging the men accused in Stephen Lawrence's murder. So when she stands beside Harry in criticizing the judgment, it gives the statement gravity, but it also raises the stakes. Because the more morally serious the messengers, the more serious the accusation sounds. This was not a vague social media complaint. This was a public response from two people with deep personal reasons to distrust parts of the media system. And yet, the central risk remains the same. If the court says the case was not proved, and the response is to call the result a whitewash, then the public debate shifts away from the evidence and toward the legitimacy of the court. That is a fight Harry may not be able to win. He may win it with his base. He may win it with people who already believe the tabloids have escaped accountability for decades. But he may lose the persuadable middle, and that middle is where reputations are often saved or destroyed. Because critics were waiting for this. They were waiting for the moment when Harry's campaign against the press could be reframed as a campaign against consequences. They were waiting for a way to say, look, this is not bravery, this is entitlement. They were waiting for the cleanest possible version of the argument. He took them to court, the court heard him, and when he lost, he blamed the court. Whether that is fully fair is almost beside the point. It is simple. It is memorable, and it fits the public mood around Harry in a way that could be damaging. Because there is a fatigue factor now. For years, Harry's conflicts carried novelty. The Oprah interview, the move to California, the memoir, the Netflix series, the court cases, the security battles. Each event felt like a new revelation, but over time, revelations become a pattern, and patterns create fatigue. At first, people ask, what did the institution do to Harry? Eventually, some people start asking, why is Harry always in a fight with an institution? That is not necessarily fair. Sometimes one person can genuinely be failed by multiple systems. But in public perception, repetition changes the emotional reaction. Sympathy can become exhaustion. Curiosity can become suspicion. Moral outrage can become, here we go again. That is the atmosphere into which this statement landed. Not in a vacuum, not at the beginning of Harry's story, but after years of public conflict, personal disclosure, institutional accusation, and media counterattack. That makes the wording much more consequential. Because when an audience is already tired, they are less generous. They do not pass every legal nuance. They do not separate righteous anger from rhetorical overreach. They hear a familiar tune and decide they already know the chorus. And the chorus Harry's critics want them to hear is this: he lost, and he blamed someone else. That is why this reaction could backfire harder than the ruling. The ruling is legal. The reaction is personal. The ruling says the case was not proved. The reaction invites people to judge Harry's character, and character judgments stick.
Now, none of this means Harry should stop caring about press accountability. It does not mean every tabloid practice is suddenly clean because one case failed. It does not erase the history of phone hacking. It does not erase the suffering of people who are targeted by newspapers. It does not mean the British press deserves blind trust. But it does mean that if Harry wants to be seen as a serious reformer, he has to choose his targets carefully. You can be furious at the tabloids. You can be disappointed in the legal standard. You can believe the law is too narrow, too difficult, or too forgiving to powerful publishers. But if you frame the court's ruling as a whitewash, you risk sounding like you are attacking the system because it did not give you the answer you wanted. And that is the exact perception his critics have been trying to attach to him for years. This is where the story becomes almost tragic, because Harry may believe that silence would be betrayal. He may believe that after everything he has said about the press, he cannot simply lose and walk away quietly. He may feel that accepting the ruling without a sharp response would look like surrender. He may feel he owes it to the other claimants, to his mother, to Meghan, and to everyone damaged by press intrusion to keep pushing. That is the emotional logic. But public strategy is not the same as emotional logic. Sometimes the statement that feels most honest in the moment is the statement that hurts you most over time. And this may be one of those moments. Because Harry's strongest position has always been moral seriousness. When he sounds wounded but principled, he can be persuasive. When he sounds furious at every institution that does not agree with him, he becomes easier to dismiss. That is the difference between defiance and self-sabotage. And this statement sits right on that line. There is also another layer here. Harry is not just any claimant. He is a prince. Even outside the working royal family, even in California, even after everything that has happened, he still carries the symbolism of the monarchy. When he criticizes a British court this sharply, it lands differently than it would from an ordinary campaigner. That does not mean he has no right to speak. He absolutely does. But it does mean the consequences are different. A private citizen can vent after losing a case, and most people forget. Harry vents, and it becomes a national character study. Every word becomes evidence for one side or the other. Supporters hear courage. Critics hear entitlement. Neutral viewers hear another institution being dragged into the drama. That is why the tone matters so much. And if you are finding this argument useful, hit like, because it helps signal that there is still an audience for slower analysis of fast-moving royal stories, not just outrage clips. The slow analysis here is pretty clear. Harry's legal team needed evidence strong enough to survive the courtroom. Harry's public team needed language careful enough to survive the media cycle. The first part failed in court. The second part is now being tested in public. And the early signs are not comfortable for him. Associated newspapers can now claim not only that it won, but that Harry's side is refusing to accept the legitimacy of the result. They can wrap themselves in the language of press freedom. They can say the case wasted court time, consumed enormous costs, and ended with the claimants attacking the judgment instead of accepting the evidence problem. That is a very strong defensive posture, and it is made stronger by Harry's own words. This is the irony. Harry's statement was designed to keep the pressure on the Mail, but it may have relieved pressure on the Mail by shifting attention to Harry's reaction. Instead of the public asking, "What did the Mail do?" some will now ask, "Why is Harry attacking the judge?" Instead of debating unlawful information gathering, they will debate whether Harry is a sore loser. Instead of focusing on the historic conduct of tabloids, they will focus on whether he respects courts. That is a bad trade for him, because his advantage is strongest when the audience is thinking about press conduct. His disadvantage grows when the audience is thinking about his temperament. And right now, the reaction pushes the story toward temperament. That is why the phrase, "this could backfire," is not just dramatic language. It describes the mechanics of the situation. A statement meant to defend his cause could weaken it. A statement meant to show courage could look like grievance. A statement meant to challenge a newspaper could make the court the center of the controversy. A statement meant to keep Harry in the role of accountability seeker could recast him as someone who rejects accountability when it comes back toward him. That is the danger. And it is not theoretical. We have already seen how Harry's public image can be reshaped by the way he responds to conflict. The memoir was not judged only by what it revealed. It was judged by whether people felt he had revealed too much. The interviews were not judged only by the claims he made. They were judged by whether people felt he was healing, monetizing, explaining, accusing, or repeating. The royal rift is not judged only by who was right at the beginning. It is judged by who seems capable of moving forward now. Public perception is cumulative. Every new statement lands on top of the old ones.
So this court statement does not arrive as a fresh event. It arrives with baggage, and that baggage makes it heavier. For Harry's supporters, the statement may feel like moral clarity. They may say, finally, someone is willing to call out a system that protects powerful newspapers. For Harry's critics, it will feel like confirmation. They will say, there it is again, another defeat turned into another accusation. For everyone in the middle, it may simply feel exhausting. And exhaustion is dangerous for a public figure whose cause requires attention. Because once people stop listening carefully, the simplest frame wins. The Mail's frame is simple. Harry lost. The court vindicated us. This was a victory for journalism and a free press. Harry's frame is more complicated. He has to explain why the court's detailed rejection of the claims should not be treated as the final moral word. He has to separate the failure to prove specific allegations from the broader history of tabloid abuse. He has to persuade people that calling the ruling a whitewash is not an attack on justice, but a protest against a system that still has not delivered accountability. That may be true to him, but it is harder to sell. And in public opinion, the harder story often loses to the simpler one. That does not mean the simpler story is more accurate. It means it is easier to repeat, and repeatability matters. If a tabloid can reduce your entire reaction to one line, you have a problem. If that line is, Harry blamed the court, you have a bigger problem. This is why a quieter statement might have been smarter. Not because Harry should pretend he agrees with the ruling, not because he should abandon his beliefs, but because restraint would have kept the focus on the legal reasoning instead of his emotional response. He could have said, the ruling raises serious concerns. He could have said, the evidence challenges in historic media cases are enormous. He could have said he remains committed to reform. He could have said he respects the court but believes the judgment leaves victims without a path to accountability. That would still be forceful. It would still be critical. But it would be harder to frame as an attack on the judiciary. Instead, the whitewash language gave the story heat, and heat is useful for headlines, but dangerous for reputation. So where does this go next? There are a few possibilities. Harry's supporters may rally around him. They may argue that the court ruling proves exactly why powerful media groups are so hard to challenge. They may see the statement as bravery, not bitterness. They may say he is doing what other public figures are too scared to do. That is one path. But the other path is harsher. The loss becomes less about Associated Newspapers and more about Harry's judgment. Commentators start asking why he keeps choosing battles that leave him more exposed. Lawyers point out the evidential weakness. Media outlets focus on the costs. Critics turn the whitewash line into proof that he cannot accept defeat. And over time, the court case itself fades. But the impression remains. Harry lost. Harry escalated. Harry blamed the system again. That is the version his critics want to freeze in the public mind. The only way Harry avoids that is if he can shift the conversation back to the underlying issue without sounding like he is dismissing the court entirely. That will require discipline,
It will require careful language. It will require something his public image has not always projected in recent years: restraint. Because the biggest challenge for Harry now is not just proving that the press has done wrong, it is proving that he can fight without making every defeat look personal. That may be the real test. Not whether he can win every lawsuit. He cannot. No claimant can. The test is whether he can lose a legal battle without damaging the broader war he says he is fighting.
And right now, that is uncertain. Because this statement may energize the people already on his side, but it may also harden the doubts of everyone else. It may make supporters see courage. It may make critics see entitlement. It may make neutral viewers see a man caught in a loop, wounded by institutions, fighting institutions, losing to institutions, and then accusing institutions of failure when they do not deliver the result he wants. That loop is powerful, and it is dangerous. Because once a public figure gets trapped inside a loop, every new event becomes evidence for the same story. Even when the facts are complicated, even when the pain is real, even when the cause has merit. That is why Harry's reaction is more than a footnote. It may become the defining piece of the aftermath. The legal ruling said the claims were not proved. Harry's statement said the outcome was a whitewash. Between those two sentences is the entire battle for public interpretation. And the question now is not just who won in court. That answer is clear. The question is who wins the story after court. Because if Harry's supporters controlled the story, this becomes another example of him standing up to a press system he believes has never been fully accountable. But if his critics control the story, this becomes something much more damaging. Proof that Harry's crusade has crossed from justice into grievance, from accountability into accusation, from courage into self-sabotage. And that is why this could hurt him more than the loss itself. A lost case can be appealed, analyzed, contextualized, or left behind. A damaged public narrative is harder to repair. Because narratives do not need 436 pages. They only need one sentence. And the sentence forming around Harry right now is brutally simple. He lost the case. Then he blamed the court. Now the open question is whether that line becomes a temporary headline or the next permanent crack in Harry's credibility. So tell me in the comments how you read it. Was this a brave refusal to let a powerful newspaper define the truth? Or was it the moment Harry turned a painful legal defeat into something worse? Because the verdict ended the case, but Harry's reaction may have started the next fight.